Welcome everyone to SIGOS App Experiences webinar on critical retail app testing and monitoring for the holidays. In today's webinar, we're talking about retail mobile apps and how to get them ready for this holiday season. I'm excited we'll also be presenting a demo for you which puts theory into practice. In addition to this webinar, we have more great resources and information on our website, so please check that out at appexperience.sigos.com. And feel free to contact us at any time. We have great mobile solutions experts available who are happy to answer your questions, give you a demo, talk about your needs, or set you up with a free trial. Our speaker today is Patrick Quilter from Quilmot, who will introduce himself in just a minute. But before we start, I just want to let you know this webinar will be recorded, and we will be sending you the recording when it becomes available so you can watch it on demand anytime. I also want to let you know that at the end of the webinar, we'll be dedicated to a Q&A as time permits. So if you look in your control panel, you should see a question section where you'll be able to submit your questions. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait until the end. I'll do my best to go through those questions and field them to Patrick during that time. And if you had a question and we weren't able to answer it, just shoot us an email at appexperience@sigos.com and our team would be happy to answer them for you. And without further ado, I'll pass it off to Patrick.
All right, great. Thank you, Margarita. I'm Patrick Quilter, owner of Quilmot, and I'm happy to be presenting today once again with our partner company, SIGOS. And today we're going to talk about critical retail testing and monitoring for the holidays. All right. So, yes, another holiday season is upon us, and no one understands this more than the retail business, and in particular, the app development teams that are supporting them. Retail and technology have proven to be a natural fit, and because of this, competition for every sale and every dollar has intensified. Retail apps that want to remain relevant have to be streamlined, secure, accessible on desktop web browsers and mobile devices, and also facilitate points of sale. Development teams know that their app will be judged not only by the number of downloads, but more importantly, how well they are moving product. So let's take a look at a quick statistic here. And as you can tell, the stakes are high, billions of dollars high. And at this time last year, it was predicted that the top 500 mobile commerce sites will generate more than $220 billion in online sales. So that means or results in a 53% increase since 2016. And another statistic, also from related to last year, is that retail app installs spiked about 900,000 around Thanksgiving, and on Black Friday it peaked at more than 1.2 million app installs. So if last year is any indication of consumer excitement around retail apps, then development teams better be prepared. So what are the consequences for retail development teams that are not prepared? Well, today's mobile consumers are more demanding and fickle than ever before, and even more so when it comes to retail apps these days. So from the statistics above, we can see that number one, most users will wait no longer than 3 seconds for an application screen to render before becoming annoyed or bored with the app. Secondly, only 16% of people are willing to give slow apps more than 2 chances before losing interest in that app. And number three, users tend to abandon their shopping cart at more than a 50% rate. So intuitively, we can probably make an accurate and educated guess that this is due to performance or some type of a load issue. What's more concerning is the common reaction that that users of retail apps have towards poorly performing applications. So let's take a look at the study here. In this study, we can see some common reactions. At the top of the list is that 48% of people uninstalled the poorly performing app. 33% just decided to stop using it altogether, and 32% looked for alternative apps, which means they went to competitors. So to make a long story short here, with fierce competition between competing retail apps, and App Store rating systems that are publicly facing, there's not a whole lot of room for tolerance or mistakes. So now let's talk about some common pitfalls when it comes to putting together a retail app. So first thing to note here is that sophisticated UX UI design is not the goal. And for some, it may be hard to resist, but trying to implement unique, flashy designs may actually end up confusing users and sending them to competitor apps. It's understandable to want to stand out, but retail app users want less steps to actually purchase something, not more. They also want something familiar and perhaps a consistent look and feel across all platforms so they can easily switch between a desktop browser and then work in a mobile app and still experience the same flow. So they want to be able to translate how they're supposed to purchase something across several different platforms. The next thing to understand here is that sometimes there is a point when fast is fast enough. So let's elaborate on what it means not to overcomplicate functional and performance goals. So let's take an example. A customer cannot easily tell the difference between something that takes 1.2 seconds and something that takes 1.3 seconds to load. So a page. Down to the millisecond, most users are not going to notice that. A customer may believe that certain transactions should take longer, like maybe payment screens, and others should take less time. And this kind of skews their view of what performance actually should be. So what does this mean for retail and just in general app developers? That maybe instead of wrestling over every little millisecond around every transaction, what we really need to be doing is focusing and understanding our customers' expectations, and then picking the areas that are most critical and making sure those are performing optimally. So yes, there is a point that fast is fast enough, but at the same time, we don't want to take performance for granted. And if we look at some of the data in this study, we can correlate performance to user behavior, particularly for retail. Maybe these were activities done that's a self-service task, or just purchasing a product, the steps that go into purchasing a product, or simply just putting something in a shopping cart. And what was found is that bad performance impacts the likelihood of conversion, meaning the purchasing. But oddly enough, the opposite isn't true. Really good performance doesn't positively impact conversion or compel someone to buy your product. But bad performance may discourage them from buying it. So the takeaway here is that above average performance and getting back to the basics of online shopping is what keeps retail apps viable. So how do we do that? How do we keep our apps viable? Well, we need to optimize what actually impacts the customer and drives the business growth. So in regards to design for functionality and performance, what we mean here is that design, functionality, and performance only matters when it impacts the business outcome. In regards to validating from the customer's point of view, our goal should be to ensure critical sections of our retail app function and perform reliably for the customer. In regards to understanding what features drive conversion, we should realize that we may have some areas of our application that are seldom visited. If they are not important to a critical user journey, then these factors really don't matter. We need to spend our development time wisely and on the critical areas. And then finally, building a testing practice that ensures critical features or reliability. When we talk about this, we mean utilizing the tools that provide automation for functional tests and monitoring our most critical transactions for availability. So at this time, let's now take a look how SIGOS app experience does exactly that. And what we're going to take a look at here is the interface that brings us into SIGOS app experience. And in this panel here, we'll see the number of devices that are available to us for us to acquire. And in this case, I'm working with a real physical actual device. And I can open up any application that I want to upload and install on this device and work with it manually. So if I wanted to get some immediate feedback on anything that I might be developing, and a lot of times developers want to do this, we can simply acquire a device and start walking through some manual steps. Secondly, when we want to get more sophisticated and actually build automation, that all starts off with creating a project. So on our panel here, we're going to start off by creating an automated test. So we saw that there were a number of devices available to us that we can choose from. And one of our first steps after filling out the project is to find that device that I had used and was keying around in, going from screen to screen, doing my manual testing. I already have it acquired, so now I'm going to be able to just pull it into my project here and start to get to work on it. So in the scripting portion, we're going to start thinking of things in terms of actions. And in our actions, I will create a new one. And I'm going to implement this action for the device that I had acquired and had set up for my scripting component. Okay, so I see on the left side here that I have a grid, and my application is to the left. I can change the zoom on it. I can make it fit within the window in a particular way, or I can leave it as is and start to interact with it by creating some automation steps. So the first thing that I want to do is pull over something that actually launches the application that I want to start with. This is a particularly logical starting point. We want to have our script begin by actually launching an application. So when I click this drop down here, I see all the applications that are installed on the device. And in this way, I save the particular application that I want to launch. And just to show what that looks like, let's run this one step real quick and see that it does indeed pop open the Amazon application. So that's great. Now we want to add some more steps into this. So what I'm going to do here is actually run our recorder. And you may have seen tools that do this in a similar fashion, but this is a great way to quickly set up an automated script. And as I click and do each of the interactions with the application, it starts to fill out the grid to the left and capture my steps. So in this case here, I want to drill down the tree of what's available to purchase in Amazon, and I'm going to pick a particular section in the books, in the search for books area, to actually verify that I got to this page. So I'm lining up where that prime icon is with this verification step. So that was the last thing that I added here. So now I can see my steps from top to bottom. Last thing I'm going to do is put in a step to close the application, because every time I want to rerun, I want to make sure I'm starting off with a fresh application. And to actually ensure that, I'm going to drag that all the way up to the top. And this way, my very first step is going to close any open application, any open Amazon application that might still be there. Now, to validate that I've done all my steps correctly, let me go ahead and run it from top to bottom and see the steps that I just recorded actually get played back now. So we start off with closing the application. It relaunches it. We click on the link. We click on the books link. We pick mysteries and thrillers. And then we verify that the price and prime icon are displaying. Now we can view the results of all the individual steps, and we see that everything passed along the way. And let's take a look at our last step here, the verification point, and we can see the two different checkpoints here. One was the starting, the page that I left, and the page that I landed on, and then the comparison is done on image 2 to make sure that we did indeed get to the end of the intended action. So now that we have those actions here, let's start talking. So that would make up an automated test, but we also might want to do something to monitor this particular action. So we're going to move over to the scripting tab now, and we're going to set up the first part of putting in a transaction. And what we're going to do here is set a threshold. And we're going to make sure that this threshold, this particular area that we're going to surround with the transaction, that it completes in an acceptable manner of time. And we've decided that this threshold is going to measure 3 seconds. And we're going to put this around those automated steps that search for the book at the end, right before our verification point. And we're saying if I make that last click on the icon that gets me into mysteries and thrillers, I want to make sure that the first book renders or displays within 3 seconds. Otherwise, that's a problem. That's something that's going to annoy the users, and I run the risk of losing them if I don't fix that. So my first step in the process is to create that transaction, and now I can come back over to my action steps here, and I'm going to take the first step in converting my automated tests into a transaction that I can monitor over and over again. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is, just so I have some type of reference as to what this step is, you can see that by default when we record, everything is object touch 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to change that name and make it much more specific. So this is my search book step. Then I'm going to come down into my widgets over here, and I'm going to pull over what's called a transaction widget, and more specifically toggle transaction. And what this does is it starts my counter. So if I scroll over a little bit here, I'm going to pick the transaction that I created, that one where we decided it was going to be 3 seconds, and I'm going to say this toggle transaction starts the counter at 0. And then I'm going to put in some logic on my verification point. And once this is done populating, I'm going to then put another transaction step under each of these paths here. So what the paths are measuring is whether that page loaded correctly or not. So if it did load correctly, I'm simply just going to say stop the transaction and see if it was less than 3 seconds. If for some reason I didn't get to that page, I'm going to stop the transaction also, and I'm automatically going to flag this as a failing step in my transaction. For whatever reason, I wasn't able to get to that screen, so we're going to flag that as a failure in our monitoring scheme. And when I'm done adding those transactions, so again, I have a start transaction and I have 2 stop transactions, and they're being controlled by whether I was able to get to those screens or not. So once that's done, the next thing I'm going to do is come back over to my scheduling pick under monitoring, and now I'm going to set up a transaction policy. So the first thing I did in setting up transactions was just to create the threshold. Now I'm going to set up a policy, which simply just means how do I handle things when my transaction is violated, when 3 seconds was too long. And what we're going to do here is set up something to take some action. And the first thing that I've elected to put in is that if this happens one time out of one time, I want something to happen. And what's going to happen here is I'm going to have a problem. And the reason is I need to first define what that action is. So that's what brings us over into the alert section. The alert section for what we're going to do here is simply just send an email. So I can set the severity when this alert gets triggered, and I can provide an email address that gets notified, all tying back to my 3-second threshold. When that 3 seconds is violated, this email should fire. So again, first we had to define what that action is, what that alert is, and now we can wire it into our transaction policy. So notice from the drop-down, the alert that I just created is finally in there. So if that threshold is violated just one time, that alert is going to get called, and that alert will send me an email. So the final step in my process here is to actually create a monitor. Okay, so I have one problem here, and that is I can't point my monitor just to an action. I actually have to create a test case first. So going back over to my scripting section, I'm going to pull over a widget that calls the action that I created, and I'm going to wrap it into a test case. So when I select it, there's action 1. There's the thing that has all of my steps in it. Okay, so now I've saved it. I've wrapped my test case with my action, and you can start to piece together that if I wanted to add more specific actions and continue to add them to this test case, I could build up a whole bunch of steps or routines, something that actually maps to my application or business process. So the next step is to assign this monitoring script to run on a particular device. And I'm going to publish this monitor to the development environment because I'm still working out some of the kinks. Some final things that I'm going to set here is I want this monitor to run continuously. I could schedule it to run periodically, but I've decided to do it continuously. And as soon as I check this or publish this monitoring script, I want it to start running right away. So those are the 2 adjustments I made at the bottom, and then I just validated that I filled out everything correctly. So now that I've done that, I can publish my whole project. So monitors, scripts, the device that I'm going to run on is all packaged up and sent to our live server. So in this way, we actually will have something to look at, and when we start viewing results and seeing what's going on, right here we'll enable the monitor. So this actually turns it on now that it's been pushed to the live server, and everything should be good to go. So I'm going to click on this link over here to the left, and all the information about the monitor is displayed to us through a web browser. And here I can see the monitor that I created. See at the bottom here, I just called mine M1, and I can see the status is running. So from the dashboard, this provides the ability to view the stats of our most recent executed monitors running, any upcoming schedules and live device screenshots and monitoring scripts, and just being able to execute them. And if we move into the monitoring section here, we can start to see monitoring results and what this looks like over time. So I've actually drilled, it takes a while for these statistics to start populating and showing up, so I've actually drilled into a previous monitoring solution that has been running a little bit over time, just to give you a flavor of some of the different sections that you can go into that have to do with transaction summaries. There's candlestick reports. There's all different types of things that you can look at to get some meaningful statistics. And then here we have the execution report. And this is an exhaustive list of every single monitor run in your system. And by default, runs are arranged most recently from first to last. and it has information about the device, the carrier on the device, run results, and a few links that will take you to either failed runs or you can see what's actually going on in the successful runs as well. If we needed to drill down, we could filter on items. So with that set up, I wanted to switch mine to the development environment because remember I mentioned we published our project to the development environment. So to get to that specific information, we needed to make that filter. And we can see here, for whatever reason, under one particular run, I had a failure on what I was monitoring. And if I look at the screenshots it has, I can see all the steps, same as we did in SIGOS app experience. So in the web view here, I can see it looks like I'm stuck on a screen for some reason. So this might prompt me either, number one, to get an alert, or number two, I can also set my alerts up to take action for me. And maybe it's just a matter of restarting the device, and I really don't need to be notified unless this keeps occurring over and over again. So let's take a look at something that actually shows a successful test run, monitoring run. Again, we can see all the steps that this went through. And if we look at where the comparison is being done, remember we wanted to make sure we ended up on the same page every time. Well, we have that here. And again, if we did get an alert, this is an example of one of the emails that automatically gets generated. So this would show up in our email box anytime there was an issue that happened on the device. Okay, so that's essentially SIGOS app experience in a nutshell. So as you can see here, we had a couple of different things going on. We started off thinking about functionality, about the critical areas in our retail application, and the things that we just wanted to make 100% sure that they don't have problems, that we can run something, an automated routine, and have some assurance that if our users go through these particular steps, they're not going to encounter errors. If we were building an application and we were pumping things out there very quickly, we do run the risk, under stressful conditions. Everybody wants to make their retail app 100% right now, and it's easy to make mistakes. But with the ability to create these automated, repeatable routines, we can cover those areas more succinctly. So here's then the next thing that we did is one of the added benefits here is that we can then package up those actions and we can start grouping them together into test cases. So in my mind, the first thing that I want to do is sync all of my actions to the critical functional business activities that go on in an application. And then secondly, I want to logically group those actions, which are just a collection of steps, and start syncing them together or grouping them together into an entire test case. And then with that repeatable process in mind, I can build up an entire suite of test cases, and that's where essentially the functional automated testing would end, and I can run those at any time. The other added benefit is I can then take those test cases, all that work that I had done building up that suite, and I can pick a few of them, and then I can include them in a monitoring solution. So when my application is out there running in production, I can have my script call up our application on a real physical device with different carriers, just in different locations, the different networks, iOS, Android, all types of different versions, and I can run those monitors in that platform. And if anything goes wrong, if for some reason my login goes offline, or I notice I'm getting alerts on high abandonment rate, people can't purchase something for some reason, then I will get notified and I can take proactive measures. So as a final thought here on what we're trying to cover, these are some other critical, they're fairly intuitive examples, but maybe some things that you don't think about that you could be testing against and you could be monitoring. So the easiest one is logging in and logging out. We want to make sure we can do that. Another one that's not on this list that should be, it's simply just launching the application. That's another critical area. We want to make sure that when the user clicks that icon, that they actually do have something pop up in a reasonable amount of time and without crashing or anything like that. So probably another big area where we would wrap one of these monitoring routines around. Secondly, at this time of year, coupons. We get the latest and greatest deal. This is what makes users and consumers happy, is being able to utilize coupons. So perhaps we want to have a monitoring routine that enters in some information, some test data, some type of special test data related to coupons, and making sure all that functionality is working correctly. In the example that we just went over, we saw here that we were searching for products. So we already saw the importance of doing that. Certainly searching is something that can be very heavy in an application. It relies a lot on network. So we would want to know if anything there is degrading. Shopping cart, we already talked about that example. Checking things out, moving on to the next step, just getting to that point of the purchasing process. And then, of course, store locator. If we wanted to actually, a lot of the retail apps today allow you to get started online, and then you can actually go pick something up at a real brick and mortar store. So having that, making sure that store locator functionality is working correctly. A lot of maps in with store locators, so that adds some weight to the performance. All those things can be covered with this approach. So at this point, it takes us to the Q&A, and just want to check in with Margarita here to see how we're doing on Q&A. Margarita, are you there with any questions?
Sorry, I realized I was on mute.
On mute.
I have a few questions from a few of you, and so I'm just going to pick them in random order. One of you asked, what can be done for areas of the app that we don't want to waste time tweaking for performance?
Right. So yeah, and going back to one of the points that we were talking about, we want to focus our attention on the critical pieces. So the critical pieces are the short steps that actually get the customer to the point where they're able to get their product and purchase it. So this is a good question, because what if there's, we've all heard the risks or getting bad ratings in the App Store because the application looks like it's too slow. What if you don't want to spend a lot of time in that area, but you also don't just want to ignore the fact that you have a slow couple of pages when you run particular transaction, even if they're not hit all that often. You still like to address it in the best possible way. So what a lot of times developers and designers will do is create what's called like temporary information containers. And what this looks like is it shows like the application itself is trying to render. So it's not just dead space, it's not just a page, and it's certainly not just a status bar or one of those icons that runs on the device that looks like something's loading and you finally wait for it to disappear. It looks like the application itself is trying to load something. Some action is occurring to fill out the information in the containers. And so what we're waiting for there is the actual images or text to fill in once that slow network process is finally completed. So this helps keep the users engaged because they can start to see the dummy content forming, and it gives them at least an idea or a template of elements when loading the content. It makes users a little bit more familiar with the overall structure of the content being loaded. So it's a user experience technique, and again, it's there to help people start to at least do something. They're getting an idea of how they're going to navigate the application, even though the application hasn't fully loaded yet, and that's all driven by those containers.
Okay, we had a question here. It says, would it be possible to also check if live content is available in the app, like VOD content? I don't know if it's VOD or vid content. Is it possible to check for video and audio?
So yeah, so there, when we were in the application itself, we were looking at a number of the widgets over here. So the first thing that I would do is, depending, if that's the specific task at hand, look to see if there's a widget over here that we can pull into our script and actually grab that information. And if there's not, there's actually another avenue that we can go down, where we have these widgets out of the box, but we can also create our own widgets, if you will, by using the Java APIs. This the product itself mirrors heavily to Java, so it's opened up to actually leverage some APIs so that you can do, if you're programming savvy, you can utilize those APIs, and with some nice documentation, you can figure out how to get to all the system level, device level information, perhaps logs that you want to get to and retrieve during runtime, and get back some more meaningful statistics.
Okay, great. And somebody asked, how can I monitor on more than one device?
So that can be done, again, looking in here in the example that I have. If I wanted to do this for a second Android device here, so let's say the Samsung Galaxy S5, one of the things that I can do is just simply add it to my project devices. So now I've pulled over 2 of them, and when I hit save, I have this option here to either implement, which means I can create a whole separate set of steps. But if I was going to run my exact same steps just on a different Android device, what I'd want to do is click this clone existing implementation, and here it is. Here's the one that we've been working on in the example right here. And when I select it, what it's going to do is pull over all of my steps. So now I can run this routine on a second device. And if I wanted to pick an iPhone, for example, I would just go through those same steps here and add to my devices per project. And the nice thing is I'd get the structure here. Now, this routine will very likely run seamlessly on another Android device, just because there's not a lot of well, I should say there's not as much variation as if I was going to do something like trying to run this routine on on iOS. That's kind of completely different. So if I did implement this for an iOS device, I like the fact that I can start off with the structure. I like the fact that my toggle transactions are already in the right place, but I would very likely have to go into some of these steps and simply update them with the particular steps that, not so much the steps, but the way that these widgets interact and hook into the device. So again, Android to Android, this implementation and cloning process is great. When I go from Android to iOS, I have a little bit more work to do, but at least I start off with the structure and all the other monitoring components in the right spot, and it's essentially just an updating process at that point.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. How quickly And we do have time, so if you want to enter your questions now, you can do that as well as Patrick is answering them. How quickly can I set up a good monitoring process?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing to think about here is really, just getting back to best practices, and so kind of to hit upon the points that we've gone over in the demo. Really, as a best practice, you start by identifying your specific transactions, right? These are the most critical things that if they weren't functioning, if they weren't available, you're essentially going to lose dollars and cents. And you start visualizing the project structure. So what we mean by the project structure is exactly what we were filling out over here. What are our actions going to be? How should we logically group our actions into individual test cases? Do we want to have one test case per action, or do we like having 5 actions and being able to string them together into one test case? That's kind of the idea. And then you keep progressing. So the next thing, we'd want to have some idea of the high-level monitors that we want to put in place and start executing those. And then simply execute your monitors, and then we're coming back and checking our dashboards. And we're looking for things like, are there any error messages? Does the script not make sense for some reason? Things that could happen also is that maybe developers change on a build the sequence of the way the steps would go, which would prompt us to have to come back and update our actions. But we're progressing through these items here, and as I mentioned, I published my monitoring to a development environment. So then we would take a second pass and start refining those errors and adjusting any of the policies. Maybe we just took a bad guess on how long we think transaction times should actually be. Sometimes maybe we were overcritical in some areas. But this is a good practice, because this is a good way of looking at it as a best practice, because sometimes we don't really know till we actually see it occurring. So we would go through a couple of iterations of that till we finally got it the way that we wanted in the development monitoring environment. And then finally we would deploy the monitor into production, and then just keep tracking the data from there through the dashboards.
Cool. We got a couple more questions, new questions. Someone asked, how are the elements of screen recognized? Is it capture or elements such as buttons, text, and other?
Right. So when I ran the recorder here, you may have noticed this map laying out. So this was a map of the screen that I was on in the application. And so what's happening here is that this is what we call object level information. So the object information is nice because it's very concrete. The way that the widgets hook in and identify elements that are on the screen is by looking at specific object properties, and those properties are set by the developers. So it's a very robust and solid way of always identifying the right area. The other thing that's nice about being able to hook into objects is developers can move those objects on all over the page, and the automation, the widgets, are going to be able to locate that because they're looking for properties. They're not looking for a particular space on the page, or text is also something that can be, it's highly likely that text will change, so trying to anchor on that is not as good as anchoring on this object information here.
I'd also like to add to Patrick's response is that object tends to be the way elements are recognized, but we also do offer image validation and text validation in rare instances, or in special instances where objects can't be, like let's say object ID. Let's say you're using object ID, and let's say object ID changes for whatever reason. We do all three. We do object, text, and image validation. or
Yeah,
recognition.
that certainly is a good point, and so especially like if you were going to do, if you got to a particular page and you just wanted to verify that some text existed on the page, or you wanted to compare images, that's a good point. That would be another important time to use those, the way of looking at the pages and those objects.
Yep, so we do all three. And then another question is, are these smartphone devices simulated, or are these real devices which are located in a data center? Also, do you support all iOS devices without a jailbreak?
So these are not simulated devices. These are real physical devices, and yes, they are in a data center. So when I brought up that list originally under my devices here, this just gives us a look at all the options that we have available to us, all the things that we can acquire and use. So even though I'm working with them and I'm doing everything through this screen interface here, I'm actually interacting with the physical device that's wired up in the data center. And that's extremely important because you're not getting the same level of testing off of simulators and emulators. You actually have to get down to the device level just for the some of the obvious reasons. Manufacturers do things on the device a little bit differently that can impact your application. Carriers do things that have an impact. Location has an impact. These are all things that only a physical device can provide. In regards to the jailbreaking, Margarita, do you have a thought on that? How these iOS devices are set up?
Yeah, there's no jailbreaking or rooting. And actually, something I wanted to add on into your last thing about the data centers, these are real devices, as Patrick mentioned. They are hosted in our data centers, or we also do have the option to, you can host these devices on premise. So if you want to put these devices behind your own firewall, you are able to do that. We are completely flexible on the deployment of these devices. We just have one last question, which right now, wait, yeah, okay. One last question, it says, ¿Pueden enviar el video, which is in Spanish, are you able to send the video? So as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the webinar, we are recording this webinar in case you want to watch it again, and we will be sending you a link when it becomes available. So please look out for that in your email. It does take a little bit of time for the recording to become available and things like that. So thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Special thanks to Patrick for leading this webinar. Before we go though, I just want to share a few things. We have a super quick survey when this webinar finishes that we'd love for you to fill out. It gives us an idea of how we did and gives you the chance to share what topics you'd like to hear next. We also have a couple of handouts for you as a takeaway with more info on our mobile app testing and app monitoring solutions. So please download that from your control panel under handouts and share it with your colleagues who weren't able to attend. And of course, as I mentioned, the recording will be available soon. And as you saw on the last slide, App Experience offers free personal demos of all of our solutions, performance app monitoring, test automation, and manual testing in case you want to get a closer look at our all-in-one platform and discuss your personal needs with one of our mobile experts. Or even if you just want to try testing out your own mobile app or site with our free trial to get a hands-on experience of our testing tool. We also provide professional services for those who are interested in scripting, training, or consulting. So for example, if you need help writing scripts, which you can use for both your test automation and app monitoring, so you can reuse them both on our single platform, we can help with that as well. And finally, I know this is very long, but please check out our website, appexperience.sigos.com. Our website was launched earlier this year. It's still in the process of being improved, and we're adding a lot more information and resources. And if you've heard of Keynote Mobile Testing or Device Anywhere, that's us. We're under a new name. We're still the same solid product and are continuously driving innovation in the mobile space. Also connect with us on social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and we also have a blog. And that concludes our webinar. Thanks everyone who joined. We hope to talk to you soon and see you again in our next webinar. Happy holidays to you all.